You're telling me this kid designed the most structurally sound pier foundation we've tested in 30 years? Admiral Richardson stared at the engineering report, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the classified document. The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Navy's lead structural engineer, nodded grimly. The Lake Tahoe pier design that everyone mocked at the engineering conference last month, it's identical to our classified submarine-based blueprints, down to the molecular-level concrete specifications. The Admiral's face darkened. How does a 24-year-old community college dropout have access to our most sensitive military engineering secrets? That's just it, sir. He doesn't. Elena's voice carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean forward. He invented it. The twist that would soon shatter everything they thought they knew about David Chen had been hiding in plain sight for months. While the engineering elite had dismissed him as an unqualified dreamer at the International Marine Engineering Symposium, the U.S. Navy had been secretly building their most advanced underwater facility using his exact specifications. The same design that had earned him ridicule and professional exile was now classified at the highest levels of national security. But Admiral Richardson wasn't the only one who'd underestimated David Chen. Department Chair Professor Harrison Walsh had built his career on crushing promising young engineers who threatened his authority, and he'd made David his most recent target. What Walsh didn't know was that David's revolutionary pier design had caught the attention of forces far beyond the academic world. Forces that would soon expose Walsh's decades of stolen research and academic fraud, the story of how a brilliant young engineer became the most sought-after structural designer in the country, would unfold through a series of confrontations that would shake the foundations of both the academic and military establishments. From the humiliating presentation that ended David's academic career to the secret Navy meetings where his designs were being implemented. From the discovery of Walsh's criminal activities to the final confrontation that would restore David's reputation, this was a tale of genius, overlooked, prejudice exposed, and justice finally served as Admiral Richardson closed the classified file. He had no idea that David Chen was already 3 steps ahead, and that the young man they'd all dismissed was about to bring down one of the most corrupt academic institutions in the country. The pier design was just the beginning. The PowerPoint slide flickered on the massive screen as David Chen stood before 300 of the world's most distinguished marine engineers, his hands shaking as he gripped the laser pointer. The International Marine Engineering Symposium had been his dream venue since freshman year, and now he was living his worst nightmare. So you're suggesting Professor Harrison Walsh's voice cut through the auditorium like a blade, that your community college education has equipped you to revolutionize pier foundation technology that MIT and Stanford engineers have been perfecting for decades. David's throat felt like sandpaper. The underwater concrete polymerization process I've developed creates a bond that's 40% stronger than traditional 40%. Walsh's laugh echoed through the sound system. Young man, do you have any idea how many graduate students have made similar claims? How many PhD dissertations have been written about incremental improvements to marine foundation systems? The audience murmured, and David caught sight of several people taking photos with their phones. Not of his design, of him. The kid who'd somehow gotten onto the main stage to embarrass himself in front of the engineering world's elite, Professor Walsh. David's voice steadied. If you'd look at the molecular structure analysis on slide 12, I've seen enough. Walsh stood from his front row seat, his 6-foot frame imposing even from a distance. Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why our symposium has peer review processes. We cannot allow every community college student with a CAD program to waste our time with amateur war presentations. David's face burned. These aren't amateur calculations. I've spent 3 years developing the mathematical models that prove mathematical models. Walsh's voice rose. You mean the equations you copied from established textbooks? The same foundation principles that real engineers have been using for decades? The audience began to shift uncomfortably. David saw Dr. Patricia Morrison from the Naval Engineering Corps leaning forward in her seat, studying something on her tablet. She'd been taking notes throughout his presentation. Unlike most of the others who'd been checking their phones, Dr. Morrison Walsh called out, Surely you can educate this young man about the rigorous testing requirements for military-grade marine structures. Dr. Morrison looked up, her expression carefully neutral. Actually, Professor Walsh, I'd be interested to hear more about the polymer binding agent Mr. Chen mentioned. The chemical composition sounds ... innovative. Walsh's jaw tightened. Patricia, surely you're not suggesting that this untested theory has any practical application. I'm suggesting that dismissing new ideas without proper evaluation isn't scientific. Method, Harrison. The tension in the room was palpable. David felt caught between two opposing forces, his presentation forgotten as the academic heavyweights began their own battle. Mr. Chen Walsh's voice had taken on a patronizing tone. Why don't you tell us about your educational background? Help the audience understand your ... qualifications. For proposing revolutionary changes to established engineering principles, David's heart sank. This was the moment he'd been dreading. I attended Riverside Community College for 2 years, majoring in civil engineering. I had to leave to support my family when my father was injured in a construction accident. The murmurs grew louder. Someone in the back row said, "Community college dropout," loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "And your work experience?" Walsh pressed. "I've been working for Chen Family Construction for the past 3 years. We specialize in residential foundations and small commercial projects. So you're telling us that your experience with basement, foundations and strip mall parking lots has somehow prepared you to redesign marine engineering systems that protect billion-dollar infrastructure?" David's hands clenched into fists. "Professor Walsh, my family's construction company may be small, but we've never had a foundation failure. Not once. Because I understand soil mechanics and concrete chemistry at a molecular level. That molecular level." Walsh's laugh was cruel. "Do you even have access to an electron microscope? Do you know what peer review means? Have you published a single paper in a legitimate engineering journal? I've submitted papers to 12 journals over the past 18 months. They were all rejected without review." Without review? Walsh's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Or perhaps because they lack the rigor expected in academic publishing. Dr. Morrison stood up. "Harrison, that's enough. Mr. Chen, I'd like to schedule a private meeting to discuss your research. The Navy is always interested in innovative approaches to marine construction." Walsh's face went pale. "Patricia, I hardly think the Navy is perfectly capable of evaluating engineering proposals on their own merits," she said coolly. "Mr. Chen, are you available tomorrow morning?" David nodded, not trusting his voice. Around him, the audience was buzzing with conversation. Some were already packing up their materials, dismissing him as a waste of time. Others were watching the exchange between Walsh and Morrison with obvious fascination. "Well then, Walsh," said his voice tight with controlled anger, "I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree about the value of proper academic credentials in engineering research." As David began to pack up his materials, his laptop screen still showing the Pier design that had taken him 2 years to perfect, he overheard a group of graduate students from Walsh's university. "Did you see his foundation calculations? They're actually pretty sophisticated." Walsh shut him down before he could explain the polymer chemistry. "I wanted to hear more about the curing process." "Yeah, but come on. Community college dropout versus MIT professor, there's no contest." David's hands stilled on his laptop bag. These students had seen something in his work that their professor had refused to acknowledge. As he walked off the stage, he caught Dr. Morrison's eye. She nodded slightly, and for the first time in months, David felt a flicker of hope. But as he reached the auditorium exit, he heard Walsh's voice over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we have standards in our profession. Academic rigor exists for a reason. We cannot allow unqualified individuals to waste our time with half-baked theories and dangerous proposals." The applause that followed felt like a physical blow. David pushed through the exit doors, his cheeks burning with shame and anger. He'd spent 3 years developing his Pier design, pouring every spare moment into research that he'd been certain would change everything. Instead, he'd been humiliated in front of the entire engineering community. His name would be associated with this disaster for years to come. Every Google search would bring up videos of his failed presentation and Walsh's dismissive comments as he stood in the hotel lobby watching the engineering elite file out of the auditorium. David made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for his cousin, Jason, who worked in patent law. "Jason, it's David. I need to file some patents." "Tonight, David. It's almost midnight. Can't this wait until—" "No, it can't wait. I need to protect my Pier design before someone steals it." There was a pause. "What Pier design? The one that's going to make us millionaires? Or destroy my life completely?" As David walked toward the elevator, he had no idea that Dr. Morrison was already on her phone with the Pentagon, and that Professor Walsh was about to discover that his newest target was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The unmarked building in Arlington looked like every other glass and steel office complex along the highway. But David's security clearance paperwork had taken 6 weeks to process. As he sat in the sterile waiting room, he wondered if Dr. Morrison's interest in his Pier design had been genuine or just professional courtesy. Mr. Chen, a young woman in a Navy uniform, appeared at his elbow. "Dr. Morrison is ready for you." The conference room was windowless and intimidating, filled with people David didn't recognize. Dr. Morrison sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 men in suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a spy movie. "David, thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet Admiral Richardson, Director of Naval Engineering Operations, and Mr. Stevens from the Defense Intelligence Agency." David's mouth went dry. "Dia, please, sit down." Admiral Richardson's voice was gravelly with age and authority. "We need to discuss your Pier design. I don't understand. It's just a foundation system for lakefront properties." Mr. Stevens opened a thick folder and slid a photograph across the table. "Is this your design?" David stared at the image. It showed a massive underwater structure, far larger than anything he'd ever imagined. But the foundation elements were unmistakably his. The polymer binding system, the molecular-level concrete specifications, even the innovative rebar placement, it was all there. "Where did you get this?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "That's classified," Stevens replied. "What we need to know is how you developed specifications that match our most sensitive military engineering projects." David's mind raced. "I developed that system for residential Pier foundations. The chemistry principles are the same regardless of scale." Mr. Chen, Admiral Richardson, leaned forward. "Do you understand that the structure in that photograph is part of a classified submarine base worth $2 billion? "I had no idea." David's hands were shaking. "I swear, I had no idea." Dr. Morrison spoke up. "We believe you, but we need to understand how you independently developed technology that our best engineers have been working on for 5 years. 5 years. David stared at them. "I've been working on this for 3 years. I started right after my father's accident, when I had to figure out why our foundation systems were failing in certain soil conditions." Stevens made a note. "Tell us about your research process." David took a deep breath. "I started with basic soil mechanics, but I realized that traditional concrete chemistry wasn't accounting for underwater polymerization at the molecular level. So I began experimenting with different binding agents, testing how they performed under pressure, testing how Admiral Richardson's eyes narrowed. I built scale models in my garage, concrete samples, pressure chambers, chemical analysis equipment that I bought used from a lab that was closing down. You conducted this research independently. No outside funding, no academic supervision, just me, and about $50,000 of my own money that I should have been saving for college." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Dr. Morrison spoke. "David, your Pier design isn't just innovative, it's revolutionary. The Navy has been trying to solve underwater foundation problems for decades, and you've created a system that outperforms everything we've tested." "But Professor Walsh said—" "Professor Walsh," Stevens interrupted, "is currently under investigation by the Department of Education for research fraud." David's jaw dropped. "What?" "It appears that Dr. Walsh has been stealing research from graduate students and junior faculty for over a decade, publishing their work under his own name, claiming credit for innovations he didn't develop." Admiral Richardson pulled out another folder. "We've been tracking the source of several breakthrough technologies that have appeared in military applications over the past few years, technologies that Dr. Walsh claimed to have developed." "You're saying he's been stealing from other people and selling it to the military?" We're saying he's been stealing from other people and claiming government contracts based on research. He didn't do. Stevens corrected. The military applications came later through legitimate channels. David felt dizzy. So when he attacked my presentation, he was probably trying to discredit you before you could expose his fraud. Dr. Morrison said, your Pier design is so advanced that it would have raised questions about his other claimed innovations. But I'm just a community college dropout. How could I threaten someone like Walsh? Admiral Richardson smiled grimly. Mr. Chen, you're not just a community college dropout. You're a goddamn genius who's been working without recognition. While academic fraudsters like Walsh have been stealing credit for work they couldn't do in 100 years, Stevens leaned back in his chair. We need to ask you something, and we need you to be completely honest. Have you shared your Pier design with anyone else? Anyone at all? David thought carefully. I submitted it to 12 engineering journals. They all rejected it without review. I presented it at the symposium, and I filed patents last month. Patents. Dr. Morrison sat up straighter. What kind of patents? Complete system patents. The concrete chemistry, the polymer binding process, the structural engineering specifications. My cousin Jason is a patent attorney. He said I needed to protect the intellectual property before someone stole it. The three officials exchanged glances. Admiral Richardson spoke first. Mr. Chen, those patents may be the most valuable intellectual property filed in the last decade. I don't understand. Your Pier design has applications far beyond lakefront properties, underwater bases, offshore drilling platforms, bridge foundations, tsunami-resistant structures. The military applications alone are worth billions. David's head was spinning. Are you saying we're saying that the Navy would like to offer you a contract to develop your Pier system for military applications? A very lucrative contract? Stevens slid a document across the table. This is a preliminary offer. Take your time to review it. David stared at the number on the contract. It had more zeros than he'd ever seen on a check. This can't be real. It's real, Dr. Morrison said, but there are conditions. You'll need to work with our engineering team. You'll need security, clearance, and you'll need to testify about Professor Walsh's attempts to suppress your research. Testify where? The Department of Education is building a case against Walsh for research fraud. Your experience at the symposium is part of a pattern of academic misconduct that goes back years. David looked around the room at the three officials who were offering to change his life forever. 6 months ago, he'd been mixing concrete in his father's construction business. Now he was being offered a multi-million-dollar contract by the U.S. Navy. What happens to Professor Walsh? That depends on what our investigation reveals, Stevens said. But if our suspicions are correct, he'll be facing federal charges for fraud, theft of intellectual property, and misuse of government research funds. Admiral Richardson stood up. Mr. Chen, I want to be clear about something. You've developed technology that could revolutionize marine engineering. The fact that you did it working alone in your garage, without institutional support, without academic credentials, makes it even more remarkable. Walsh was wrong about everything, Dr. Morrison added. Academic credentials don't create innovation. Brilliant minds do. And you, David Chen, have one of the most brilliant engineering minds I've ever encountered. David felt tears welling up in his eyes. After months of rejection and humiliation, after being dismissed as an unqualified amateur, he was finally being recognized for what he'd accomplished. There's one more thing, Stevens said. We need to know if you're willing to go public with your story. Walsh's victims deserve justice, and your success could inspire other young engineers who've been dismissed by the academic establishment. David thought about all the graduate students he'd overheard at the symposium, the ones who'd seen value in his work but been too intimidated to speak up. He thought about his father, lying in a hospital bed, proud of his son despite the family's financial struggles. I'll do it, he said, whatever it takes. As David signed the preliminary contract, he had no idea that his decision would spark a revolution in both military engineering and academic accountability. The Pier design that had been mocked and dismissed was about to become the foundation for a new era of underwater construction, and Professor Harrison Walsh was about to discover that the young man he'd tried to destroy was about to destroy him. Instead, the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General had been investigating academic fraud for 15 years. But Agent Sarah Martinez had never seen a case as complex as the one building against Professor Harrison Walsh, sitting in her cluttered office, surrounded by file boxes and evidence bags. She reviewed the timeline that had emerged over the past 3 months. "David, I need you to walk me through this one more time," she said, adjusting her reading glasses as Chen sat across from her desk. "Walsh's reaction to your presentation, it was more than just academic disagreement." David shifted uncomfortably. In his chair, it felt personal, like he was trying to destroy my credibility before I could even explain my research. "And you'd never met him before that day?" "Never. But I'd submitted papers to journals where he was a reviewer. They were all rejected without explanation." Martinez opened a thick folder. "We've been analyzing those rejection letters. Walsh was the primary reviewer for 9 of the 12 journals you submitted to. In every case, he recommended rejection within 24 hours of receiving your paper." 24 hours? That's impossible. It takes weeks to properly review engineering research. "That's what we thought. But here's what's interesting. Walsh, published papers incorporating your polymer binding technology 6 months after rejecting your submissions." David's face flushed with anger. "He stole my work." "We're building a case that suggests exactly that, but it goes deeper than just your research." Martinez pulled out a timeline chart. Over the past 8 years, Walsh has published 43 papers in major engineering journals. Our analysis shows that 37 of those papers contain technology or methodologies that were first submitted by other researchers to journals where Walsh was a reviewer. 37, David's voice was barely a whisper. "Graduate students, junior faculty, independent researchers like yourself. All of them had their work rejected by Walsh, only to see him publish similar research months later." Martinez turned to her computer screen. "We've identified 17 victims so far. Engineers whose careers were destroyed because Walsh stole their research and then blocked their academic advancement. How is that possible? Don't journals have ethics oversight?" "They do. But Walsh has been gaming the system for years. He's on the editorial boards of 12 major engineering journals. He controls the peer review process for much of the published research in marine engineering." David felt sick. So when he attacked me at the symposium, he was protecting his reputation. "Your peer design was so advanced that it would have raised questions about his other claimed innovations. If people started looking closely at his research history, they'd discover the pattern of theft." Martinez opened another file. "But Walsh made a mistake when he targeted you. Your patent applications created a paper trail that we can use to prove intellectual property theft. How your patents were filed 3 weeks after the symposium. But Walsh submitted a preliminary patent application for similar technology days after your presentation. He tried to beat you to the patent office." David's hands clenched into fists. "Here's the problem for Walsh. Your patent applications include detailed research notes, lab results, and development timelines going back 3 years. His application has none of that documentation." Martinez pulled out a stack of photographs. "We executed a search warrant on Walsh's office last week. We found files containing research from dozens of graduate students and junior faculty, along with correspondence showing how he manipulated the peer review process." David studied the photos. Walsh's office looked like a command center for academic fraud, filing cabinets full of stolen research, computers containing thousands of rejected papers, and detailed notes about how to modify other people's work to avoid detection. "More," Martinez continued. "We've discovered that Walsh has been selling research to private companies and government contractors. Your peer design technology was sold to 3 different defense contractors before the Navy became involved. He was selling my work, your work, and the work of dozens of other researchers. We estimate that Walsh has profited over $15 million from stolen intellectual property over the past decade." David felt dizzy. $15 million. The victims deserve compensation. But more importantly, they deserve recognition for their actual contributions to engineering science. Martinez opened her laptop. "I want you to see something. We've been investigating Walsh's academic record, and we discovered that his PhD dissertation was also plagiarized. His dissertation, large portions were copied from a graduate student who died in a car accident before completing his degree. Walsh was that student's research assistant." David stared at the screen in horror. So his entire career is built on fraud. It appears so, but here's what's remarkable. Despite being surrounded by brilliant research from the people he was stealing from, Walsh never really understood the science. That's why your Pier design was so threatening. It was so advanced that it exposed his lack of genuine expertise. Martinez pulled out a recording device. I need you to listen to something. We've been monitoring Walsh's communications since the investigation began. The recording was fuzzy, but David could hear Walsh's voice clearly. The Chen kid is a problem. His design is too sophisticated for someone with his background. People are going to start asking questions. Another voice responded, can't you? Just discredit him. Make him look incompetent. I tried that at the symposium, but Morrison from the Navy is interested in his research. If they start examining his work closely, they'll realize it's more advanced than anything I've published. So what do you want to do? I need to file patents on his technology before he does. Once I have the intellectual property rights, I can destroy his credibility and claim the work as my own. David felt rage building in his chest. He planned to steal my patents. He tried, but his patent application was filed too late, and it lacked the supporting documentation that proves original research. Your 3 years of documented development work makes it impossible for him to claim ownership. Martinez closed the laptop. David, I need you to know that your case has opened the door to prosecuting one of the most significant academic fraud schemes in recent history. Walsh's victims include some of the most brilliant young engineers in the country. What happens now? We're building criminal charges for fraud, theft of intellectual property, and racketeering. The racketeering charge is particularly serious. Walsh used his position on journal editorial boards to systematically steal research and profit from it. David thought about all the young engineers whose careers had been destroyed by Walsh's greed. What about the other victims? We're working with the Department of Justice to establish a victim compensation fund. The money Walsh made from stolen research will be returned to the people he stole from. Martinez stood up and walked to her window. But there's something else, David. Your success has inspired other victims to come forward. Young engineers who were dismissed and humiliated are now speaking out about academic fraud. Really? Your story is becoming a symbol of how the academic establishment has failed brilliant minds who don't fit the traditional mold. The Navy contract, the patent success, the recognition of your work, it's proving that innovation doesn't require institutional credentials. David felt a surge of pride mixed with responsibility. So, what do I do now? You continue your work. The Navy is thrilled with your Pier design applications. But more importantly, you've become a voice for independent researchers who've been shut out of the academic system. Martinez returned to her desk. Walsh's downfall is going to send shockwaves through the engineering community. Journals will have to reform their review processes. Universities will have to examine their faculty more carefully. And young engineers will know that their work can't be stolen without consequences. When will Walsh be arrested? Soon. We're coordinating with federal prosecutors to ensure we have an airtight case. But David, I want you to be prepared for what's coming. This story is going to be national news. You're going to be the face of academic fraud reform. David nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 6 months ago, he'd been a nobody working in his father's construction business. Now he was about to bring down one of the most powerful figures in academic engineering. I'm ready, he said, for whatever comes next. As David left the federal building, he had no idea that Professor Walsh was already planning his defense, and that the final confrontation would test everything he'd learned about courage, integrity, and the pursuit of justice. Professor Harrison. Walsh's corner office at the university had always been his sanctuary, but today it felt like a prison. The morning news had broken the story of his impending arrest, and his phone had been ringing nonstop with calls from reporters, colleagues, and lawyers. Harrison, we need to talk. Dean Margaret Foster stood in his doorway, her face grim. The university is suspending you pending the outcome of the federal investigation. Walsh looked up from his computer, where he'd been frantically deleting files. Margaret, this is all a misunderstanding. That Chen kid is trying to destroy my reputation because I questioned his amateur research. Amateur research? Dean Foster stepped into the office and closed the door. Harrison, the Navy, is building submarine bases using his designs. His patents are worth millions. How exactly is that amateur? Anyone can file patents. That doesn't prove the technology works. The technology does work. It's been tested by the best engineers in the country. Foster sat down across from his desk. Harrison, I've been reviewing your research history. There are some troubling patterns. Walsh's hands stilled on his keyboard. What kind of patterns? Rejected papers that bear striking similarities to your published research. Graduate students who've complained about stolen work. Junior faculty who've been driven from the university after you reviewed their tenure applications. Academic competition is fierce. Margaret, not everyone can handle the pressure. Is that what you call it? Competition. Foster opened a folder. I have documentation here showing that you've been systematically stealing research from younger colleagues for years. Walsh's face went pale. That's ridiculous. I'm one of the most published researchers in the field. Yes, you are. The question is whether any of that research is actually yours. The office door opened, and two men in dark suits entered. Professor Walsh. I'm Agent Martinez from the Department of Education. And this is Agent Stevens from the FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest. Walsh stood up slowly, his hands shaking. This is harassment. I'm being targeted because I exposed a fraud at the engineering symposium. Sir, you have the right to remain silent, Martinez began, but Walsh interrupted. I want to make a statement. David Chen is a nobody, a community college dropout who's been coached by military contractors to file false patents. This whole thing is a setup to discredit legitimate academic research. Stevens stepped forward. Professor Walsh, we have extensive documentation of your theft of intellectual property. We have recordings of your conversations about stealing Mr. Chen's patents. We have testimony from 17 victims whose research you've plagiarized. 17. Walsh's voice cracked. That's impossible. Dr. Sarah Kim, whose polymer research you published in 2019. Dr. Michael Torres, whose foundation engineering work you claimed in 2020. Dr. Jennifer Liu, whose underwater concrete chemistry you stopped. Walsh sank back into his chair. Those were collaborative projects. I was the senior researcher. Dr. Kim was never informed that her research was being published under your name. Dr. Torres was told his work was rejected for publication. Dr. Liu was dismissed from her graduate program after questioning your use of her research. Dean Foster stared at Walsh in horror. My God, Harrison, how many careers have you destroyed? Agent Martinez pulled out a thick folder. We've identified 37 cases of research theft over the past 8 years. The victims include graduate students, junior faculty, and independent researchers whose work was stolen and published under Professor Walsh's name. Walsh's defense began to crumble. I was quality controlling their research, making sure it met academic standards. By stealing it and claiming it as your own? Stevens' voice was cold. By destroying the careers of brilliant young researchers who threatened your reputation. They were unqualified. They didn't understand the implications of their own work, like David Chen. Martinez asked. The unqualified community college? Dropout whose Pier design is revolutionizing marine engineering. Walsh's face flushed red. Chen got lucky. His design works by accident, not by design. Professor Walsh. Stevens said, we have your computer files. We know you tried to file patents on Mr. Chen's technology. We know you've been selling stolen research to defense contractors. We know you've been manipulating the peer review process to steal innovations from other researchers. You can't prove any of that. Martinez opened her laptop. Actually, we can. We have your emails to defense contractors. We have your communications with journal editors. We have your research files containing stolen work from dozens of victims. The room fell silent as Walsh stared at the evidence of his crimes displayed on the laptop screen. Years of fraud, theft, and academic misconduct laid out in devastating detail. The victims deserve justice, Stevens said, and the academic community deserves to know that one of its most prominent figures has been a fraud for years. Dean Foster stood up. Harrison, I'm terminating your employment effective immediately. The university will be conducting a full review of every paper you've published, every grant you've received, and every student you've supervised. Walsh's world was collapsing around him. Margaret, please, I've given 20 years to this university. You've given 20 years of stolen research to this university. You've damaged our reputation beyond repair. Agent Martinez snapped handcuffs on Walsh's wrists. Harrison Walsh, you're under arrest for fraud, theft of intellectual property, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." As they led Walsh from his office, he saw a crowd of students and faculty gathered in the hallway. Among them was Dr. Sarah Kim, one of his earliest victims, whose polymer research had formed the foundation of his career. Dr. Kim Walsh called out desperately, "You have to tell them. We worked together on that research." Kim's eyes were cold. "I never worked with you, Professor Walsh. You stole my research and destroyed my career, just like you did to so many others." The crowd parted as the agents led Walsh through the corridor. He saw the faces of colleagues who'd respected him, students who'd admired him, and victims who'd suffered because of his greed. Outside the building, news cameras were waiting. Walsh tried to hide his face, but the reporters pressed forward with questions. "Professor Walsh, how do you respond to charges that you've stolen research from dozens of young engineers? Professor Walsh, is it true that you tried to steal David Chen's Pier design patents? Professor Walsh, what do you say to the victims whose careers you've destroyed?" Walsh said nothing as the agents put him in the back of their car. Through the window, he could see the university where he'd built his fraudulent career, the colleagues who'd finally learned the truth about his success, and the media that would ensure his disgrace was public. As the car pulled away, Walsh realized that his attempt to destroy David Chen had instead destroyed himself. The young engineer he'd tried to discredit had exposed decades of academic fraud and brought down one of the most successful theft schemes in academic history. The peer review system that Walsh had manipulated would be reformed. The victims, whose work he'd stolen, would receive recognition and compensation. And David Chen, the community college dropout that Walsh had mocked, would be remembered as the engineer who revolutionized marine construction and exposed academic corruption. Walsh's career was over, but for his victims, justice was just beginning. The federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., buzzed with activity as victims of Professor Walsh's academic fraud scheme gathered for the sentencing hearing. David Chen sat in the front row, surrounded by 17 other researchers whose careers had been damaged by Walsh's theft of their intellectual property. Dr. Sarah Kim, now a successful polymer engineer with her own research firm, was the first to address the court. "Your Honor, I was a graduate student when Professor Walsh stole my research on underwater concrete bonding. I trusted him as my advisor, and he destroyed my academic career to advance his own." Judge Patricia Henderson listened carefully as Kim described how Walsh had manipulated the peer review process to steal her groundbreaking research, then used his position to block her from publishing her own work. "I was told my research was inadequate and poorly executed," Kim continued. "I was dismissed from my PhD program and told I wasn't suited for academic research. Meanwhile, Professor Walsh was publishing my work and receiving millions in research grants." Next to David, Dr. Michael Torres prepared his victim impact statement. Torres had been a junior faculty member when Walsh targeted his foundation engineering research, stealing his innovations, and then sabotaging his tenure application. Dr. Torres, Judge Henderson said, "Please tell the court about your experience." Torres stood up, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Your Honor, I spent 5 years developing revolutionary foundation engineering techniques. Professor Walsh reviewed my tenure file and declared my research derivative and lacking innovation. I was denied tenure and forced to leave academia. And then, 6 months later, I saw Professor Walsh presenting my exact research at the International Foundation Engineering Conference. He received a standing ovation for innovations that I had developed in my laboratory." Judge Henderson's expression hardened. "How did that make you feel, Dr. Torres?" "Devastated. I had spent years believing I wasn't good enough for academic research. I thought I was a failure. It wasn't until Agent Martinez contacted me that I learned the truth that my work was so valuable that Walsh had built his career on stealing it." The courtroom was silent as Torres returned to his seat. David felt a deep connection to these victims, brilliant minds whose work had been stolen and whose confidence had been shattered by Walsh's systematic fraud. Dr. Jennifer Liu, a chemical engineer who'd been forced to leave her graduate program after questioning Walsh's use of her research, spoke next. "Your Honor, I was 24 years old when Professor Walsh destroyed my dreams of becoming a research scientist. I had developed breakthrough concrete chemistry that could revolutionize construction, but Walsh claimed it as his own work. What happened to your career aspirations?" I was told I was too aggressive and didn't understand collaborative research. I was dismissed from my program and blacklisted from other universities. I spent 3 years working in a laboratory supply store, believing I was too stupid for scientific research. Lu's voice broke slightly. It wasn't until I saw David Chen's story in the news that I realized what had happened to me. His success gave me the courage to come forward about my own stolen research. Judge Henderson turned to the defense table, where Walsh sat with his attorney. Professor Walsh, do you have anything to say to these victims? Walsh's lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Walsh shook his head. Your Honor, I built my career on legitimate research. These accusations are the result of a coordinated attack on academic excellence. Dr. Kim stood up from the gallery. Academic excellence. You published my polymer research without my knowledge or consent. You profited from my work while I was working as a lab technician to pay my student loans. Dr. Kim was my advisee, Walsh said. Her research was conducted under my supervision, making it collaborative work. Collaborative work. Tora's voice rose. I never collaborated with you. You stole my foundation engineering research and then destroyed my career when I tried to publish my own work. Judge Henderson banged her gavel. Order in the court. Agent Martinez approached the bench. Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Professor Walsh operated a systematic scheme to steal intellectual property from young researchers. He used his position on editorial boards to identify valuable research, then manipulated the peer review process to steal that research for his own use. What is the government's recommendation for sentencing? Given the scope of the fraud, 37 documented cases over 8 years, and the damage to victims' careers, we recommend 15 years in federal prison and full restitution to all victims. Walsh's attorney stood up. Your Honor, my client has had a distinguished academic career. He's published over 200 papers and received numerous awards for his contributions to engineering science. Contributions based on stolen research, David said quietly, but loud enough for the court to hear. Judge Henderson looked at David. Mr. Chen, you're not scheduled to speak today, but I understand you were the catalyst for this investigation. Would you like to address the court? David stood up slowly. Your Honor, 6 months ago, I was a community college dropout working in my father's construction business. I had developed what I thought was a revolutionary pier design, but when I tried to present it to the engineering community, Professor Walsh humiliated me in front of 300 people. How did that affect you? I thought my career was over before it started. I believed I was too stupid and too unqualified to contribute to engineering science. But Dr. Morrison from the Navy saw value in my work, and that led to the discovery of Professor Walsh's fraud. David looked at Walsh, who was staring at the floor. Your Honor, Professor Walsh didn't just steal research. He stole dreams. He stole the confidence of brilliant young minds who had the potential to change the world. And now I'm working with the Navy to revolutionize marine engineering. My pier design is being used to build underwater bases that will protect our national security. But more importantly, the other victims in this room are finally getting recognition for their contributions to science. Judge Henderson nodded. Mr. Chen, your case has exposed one of the most significant academic fraud schemes in recent history. How do you feel about that? David thought carefully. I feel responsible for making sure this never happens again. Young engineers with good ideas deserve to have their work evaluated fairly, regardless of their educational background or institutional affiliation. Dr. Kim spoke up from the gallery. Your Honor, David's success has inspired all of us to rebuild our careers. I now run a successful polymer research company. Dr. Torres has started his own foundation engineering firm. Dr. Liu is pursuing her PhD at MIT. And that's because David proved that innovation doesn't require institutional credentials. It requires brilliant minds and hard work. Professor Walsh tried to suppress that truth, but David's success has exposed it. Judge Henderson looked at the 17 victims seated in the courtroom. I've reviewed the evidence in this case, and I'm struck by the systematic nature of Professor Walsh's crimes. He didn't just steal research, he destroyed careers, suppressed innovation, and damaged the integrity of academic publishing. She turned to Walsh. Professor Walsh, you've been found guilty of fraud, theft of intellectual property, and racketeering. The evidence shows that you built your career on the stolen work of brilliant young researchers. then used your position to prevent them from receiving recognition for their contributions. Walsh finally looked up. Your Honor, I dedicated my life to academic research. No, Professor Walsh, you dedicated your life to stealing other people's academic research. There's a significant difference. Judge Henderson consulted her notes. The victims in this case represent some of the most innovative minds in engineering science. Their stolen research has been used to build critical infrastructure, advance national security, and improve public safety. They deserve recognition for their contributions. What's the court's ruling? I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. You're also ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, totaling $8.7 million in lost wages and damages. The courtroom erupted in applause as the victims finally received justice. David felt tears in his eyes as he watched Dr. Kim embrace Dr. Torres, two brilliant minds who'd been told they weren't good enough for academic research. As Walsh was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at David one last time. This isn't over, Chen. You'll never be accepted by the real academic community. David stood up and faced his former tormentor. Professor Walsh, I don't need acceptance from the academic community. I have something better. Recognition from the people who actually use my work to build things that matter. As the courthouse emptied, David found himself surrounded by the other victims. They were no longer victims. They were survivors, innovators, and pioneers who'd overcome systematic suppression to reclaim their rightful place in the engineering community. Dr. Kim shook his hand. David, thank you for having the courage to fight back. Your success gave all of us the strength to demand justice. We're just getting started, David replied. The academic system that allowed Walsh to operate needs to be reformed. Young engineers deserve better. As David walked out of the courthouse, he knew that Walsh's conviction was just the beginning. The real work, reforming academic publishing, protecting young researchers, and ensuring that innovation was rewarded regardless of credentials, was still ahead. But for the first time in months, David felt optimistic about the future. Justice had been served, and the brilliant minds that Walsh had tried to suppress were finally free to change the world. 6 months after Walsh's sentencing, David Chen stood before the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Preparing to testify about academic fraud reform, the hearing room was packed with reporters, academics, and representatives from major universities who'd been forced to confront the systematic problems in their institutions. Senator Elizabeth Warren, the committee chair, called the hearing to order. Mr. Chen, your case has exposed widespread fraud in academic publishing. What reforms do you believe are necessary to prevent future victims? David adjusted his microphone, feeling the weight of responsibility. Senator Warren, the peer review system is broken. When a single professor can control whether research gets published, that creates opportunities for theft and suppression of innovation. What specific changes do you recommend? First, blind peer review should be mandatory. For all journals, reviewers shouldn't know who submitted the research, and authors shouldn't know who's reviewing it. Second, there should be criminal penalties for stealing intellectual property in academic settings. Senator Ted Cruz leaned forward. Mr. Chen, some critics argue that your case is an exception, not the rule. How do you respond to claims that academic fraud is rare? David pulled out a folder. Senator Cruz, since the Walsh case became public, over 300 researchers have contacted federal investigators about suspected academic fraud. The problem is far more widespread than anyone realized. The 300 young researchers, graduate students, and junior faculty who've had their work stolen by senior academics. The Walsh case gave them the courage to come forward, but the system that enabled Walsh's crimes is still in place. Senator Warren consulted her notes. Mr. Chen, you've mentioned that traditional academic credentials aren't necessary for innovation. Can you elaborate? Senator, I developed revolutionary marine engineering technology working in my garage with used equipment. Dr. Kim created breakthrough polymer chemistry as a graduate student. Dr. Torres revolutionized foundation engineering as a junior faculty. Remember, the best innovations often come from young minds who aren't constrained by traditional thinking. But universities argue that credentials ensure quality control. Do they? Professor Walsh had impeccable credentials, Ph.D. from MIT, tenure at a prestigious university, editorial positions at major journals. But his entire career was built on fraud. Meanwhile, researchers like me, who didn't have traditional credentials, were developing technology that the military now uses to protect national security. Dr. Margaret Foster, the dean who'd fired Walsh, was called to testify next. Dr. Foster, how did your university fail to detect Professor Walsh's fraud for over a decade? Foster looked uncomfortable. Senator Warren, Professor Walsh, was a master manipulator. He used his position on editorial boards to control information flow, and he targeted victims who were vulnerable to academic pressure. But there were warning signs, weren't there? In retrospect, yes. Graduate students who complained about stolen research, junior faculty who were denied tenure after Walsh reviewed their work, independent researchers whose papers were rejected without proper review. Senator Cruz pressed further. Why didn't the university investigate these complaints? Because Walsh was our most published researcher. He brought in millions in research grants and enhanced our reputation. We trusted his judgment about academic quality. Even when that judgment consistently targeted young researchers with innovative ideas, Foster's voice was barely audible. We failed our students and our mission. We prioritized reputation over integrity. The hearing continued with testimony. From other victims, Dr. Sarah Kim described how she'd been forced to rebuild her career after Walsh stole her polymer research. Dr. Michael Torres explained how he'd started his own engineering firm after being driven from academia. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Jennifer Liu, who'd been working on her Ph.D. when Walsh destroyed her academic career. Senator Warren, I was 24 years old when Professor Walsh stole my concrete chemistry research. I had developed innovations that could revolutionize construction safety. But Walsh claimed it as his own work and then had me dismissed from my program. How did that affect your life? I spent 3 years believing I was too stupid for scientific research. I worked in a laboratory supply store, thinking I was a failure. It wasn't until I saw David's story that I realized what had happened to me. And now I'm completing my Ph.D. at MIT, working on the concrete chemistry that Walsh stole. My research is being used to build earthquake-resistant structures that will save lives. Senator Warren looked around the hearing room. Dr. Liu, what would you say to other young researchers who have been told they're not good enough for academic research? I'd say that innovation doesn't require permission from the academic establishment. If you have a good idea, pursue it. File patents, document your research, and don't let anyone tell you that your work doesn't matter. The hearing concluded with testimony from Agent Martinez about the ongoing investigation into academic fraud. Senator Warren, the Walsh case, has opened the door to prosecuting similar schemes at universities across the country. We're working with the Department of Justice to establish a task force focused on academic, intellectual property theft. How many cases are you investigating? Currently, we're examining suspected fraud at 47 universities. The victims include hundreds of researchers whose work has been stolen by senior faculty. Senator Cruz asked the final question. Agent Martinez, what's the financial impact of this fraud? We estimate that stolen research has generated over $500 million in fraudulent grants and contracts over the past decade. But the real cost is the innovation that's been suppressed and the careers that have been destroyed. As the hearing ended, David was approached by a group of young researchers who'd been inspired by his story. They'd formed an organization called Independent Innovators to support researchers who were working outside traditional academic institutions. David, said Maria Santos, a chemical engineer who'd been blacklisted after questioning her professor's research practices, your success has shown us that we don't need institutional approval to pursue our ideas. What are you working on? David asked. Revolutionary battery technology that could transform renewable energy. My professor tried to steal my research, but I filed patents and started my own company. David smiled. That's exactly what we need. More independent innovation that can't be controlled by the academic establishment. As David left the Capitol building, he reflected on how much had changed in the past year. He'd gone from being a humiliated community college dropout to a successful engineer whose work was protecting national security. More importantly, he'd helped expose a system of academic fraud that had suppressed innovation for decades. The reforms that would emerge from the hearing: mandatory blind peer review, criminal penalties for academic theft, and support for independent researchers, would ensure that future generations of innovators wouldn't face the obstacles that he and the other victims had overcome. But David knew that the real change would come from young researchers who refused to accept that their ideas weren't good enough. The academic establishment that had tried to suppress their innovation was about to be transformed by the very minds it had tried to silence. The reckoning was just beginning. 2 years after the Senate hearing, David Chen stood on the deck of the USS Innovation, the Navy's newest submarine base, watching as construction crews completed the final phases of the underwater facility. The Pier system that had been mocked at the engineering symposium was now the foundation for the most advanced military installation in the world. The concrete polymerization is holding perfectly, Captain Rodriguez reported, reviewing the latest structural integrity tests. Your design is exceeding all performance specifications. David nodded, still amazed that his garage-developed technology was now protecting national security. The molecular binding process should maintain structural integrity for at least 50 years, even under extreme underwater conditions. 50 years. Rodriguez looked impressed. Most marine foundations start deteriorating after 20. That's because traditional concrete chemistry doesn't account for underwater polymerization at the molecular level. My system creates bonds that actually strengthen over time when exposed to water pressure. As they walked through the facility, David's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Kim. Patent approval came through for the earthquake-resistant concrete. 3 construction companies want to license the technology. The Independent Innovators Fund is going to be bigger than we thought. David smiled, thinking about the organization he'd helped establish to support researchers who were working outside traditional academic institutions. Using the compensation money from the Walsh case, they'd created a fund that provided grants, equipment, and legal support to independent innovators. Mr. Chen, Captain Rodriguez said, "I wanted you to know that the Navy is recommending your Pier design for the Presidential Medal of Innovation. Your work has revolutionized marine engineering." "Thank you, Captain. But the real innovation is happening with the researchers we're supporting through the Independent Innovators Fund. They're developing technologies that will change everything." David's phone rang. It was Agent Martinez from the Department of Education. "David, I have an update on the academic fraud investigation. We've prosecuted 12 professors at 8 universities for intellectual property theft. The reforms you recommended are being implemented across the country." "What about the victims?" "Over 200 researchers have received recognition and compensation for stolen work. More importantly, the new peer review system is ensuring that innovative research gets published regardless of the author's institutional affiliation." David felt a surge of satisfaction. So young researchers don't have to worry about their work being stolen. The system isn't perfect, but it's much better. Blind peer review is now mandatory for all major journals. Criminal penalties for academic theft are being enforced. And the Independent Innovators Fund is providing alternatives for researchers who want to work outside traditional institutions. After ending the call, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 years ago, he'd been a humiliated community college dropout whose ideas had been dismissed by the academic establishment. Now he was a successful engineer whose work was being used to protect national security and whose advocacy was reforming academic publishing. But the real victory was the success of the other victims. Dr. Kim's Polymer research company was developing materials that would revolutionize construction safety. Dr. Torres' foundation engineering firm was building earthquake-resistant structures in vulnerable communities. Dr. Li Hu's concrete chemistry research was being used to create disaster-resistant infrastructure. Most importantly, hundreds of young researchers were now pursuing their ideas without fear of academic suppression. The Independent Innovators Fund had supported breakthroughs in renewable energy, medical technology, and environmental engineering innovations that might never have emerged from traditional academic institutions. David's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from his father, who is now fully recovered from his construction accident and working as a project manager for Chen Family Construction. "Son, I saw the news about your Medal of Innovation nomination. Your mother and I are so proud. You've proven that good ideas can come from anywhere." As David watched the sun set over the naval facility, he thought about Professor Walsh, who was serving his sentence in federal prison. Walsh had tried to suppress innovation by stealing research and destroying careers, but his crimes had ultimately led to reforms that were unleashing unprecedented creativity in the engineering community. The pier design that Walsh had mocked was now the foundation for military installations, offshore platforms, and tsunami-resistant structures around the world. The academic fraud that Walsh had perpetrated was now being prosecuted as a federal crime, and the young researchers that Walsh had tried to silence were now changing the world. David's phone rang one final time. It was Maria Santos from the Independent Innovators Organization. "David, we just received the biggest grant application we've ever seen. A 17-year-old high school student in Iowa has developed a revolutionary solar energy system. She's been rejected by every university she's applied to because she doesn't have traditional credentials. What's her innovation? She's figured out how to increase solar panel efficiency by 40% using a crystalline structure that nobody else has thought of. Her research is more advanced than anything being done at major universities." David smiled. "Let's fund her project, and let's make sure she doesn't have to face the obstacles that we did." As David left the naval facility, he reflected on the lesson that his journey had taught him. Innovation didn't require institutional approval or academic credentials. It required brilliant minds, hard work, and the courage to pursue ideas that others might dismiss. The academic establishment that had tried to suppress his pier design was now being transformed by the very minds it had tried to silence. Young researchers around the country were developing technologies that would revolutionize everything from renewable energy to medical treatment to national security. Professor Walsh had tried to build his career on stolen innovation, but the victims he'd targeted had ultimately created a system that rewarded genuine innovation, regardless of its source. The foundation that David had built, both literally and figuratively, was stronger than anything Walsh had ever created. And unlike Walsh's fraudulent legacy, this foundation would support generations of innovators who would change the world. As David drove home to his family's construction business, where he still worked part-time to stay connected to his roots, he knew that his greatest achievement wasn't the Navy contract or the patent success or the Medal of Innovation nomination. His greatest achievement was proving that brilliant minds could overcome systematic suppression, create innovations that would benefit humanity for generations to come. The pier design that had been mocked 2 years ago was now the foundation for a new era of engineering innovation. And David Chen, the community college dropout who'd been humiliated in front of 300 people, was now the symbol of everything that was possible when innovation was given the chance to flourish. The mockery had become validation. The rejection had become recognition. And the young man who'd been told he wasn't good enough had become the engineer who'd changed everything. Justice had been served, innovation had been liberated, and the future belonged to the brilliant minds who refused to accept that their ideas weren't good enough. David Chen had built more than a pier design. He'd built a foundation for the future of innovation itself.